So my name is Christopher Vu Gandin. I am a father of two. I help launch large-scale suicide prevention programs. I'm an artist. I'm a photographer. I've recently been making music as a therapy, like kind of meditation. And gosh, yeah, I mean, I just do a lot of things that are, I feel like I always describe it like I'm a true immigrant and that I have like 5-6 jobs. It's just like the way it is. Yeah.
I love that. And you also have super cool headphones. Like, I'm so jealous.
Oh, yeah. Oh, they can help keep the hair, right?
Oh yeah, it's
It's
just
like
like a
all,
whole
yeah.
thing. Yeah. I love that. And obviously I've known you forever and love
Wow.
you and your entire family. And
Yeah.
so thank you for joining me in this conversation. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your identity as an immigrant.
So I think the way I describe myself, so I was a child refugee. I was born in Vietnam and came here when I was a baby. I was like 3 months old when my mom left. And so we were in refugee camp for about a year. We're sponsored to come into America through Maryland and ended up in Texas, basically on the border of Mexico, which is where I grew up, just like that. And I was my dad's sponsor, who became my grandma, basically, was a white lady named Maribel Miller. She was a school teacher, lovely, and she kind of like raised me until I was in 4th grade. And I think the reason that's relevant, right, is because my job at the time was to assimilate hard. Like all of my little cousins who were born here speak great Vietnamese. They actually were more immersed in like Vietnamese culture than I was, because I think as a lot, and as is true with a lot of immigrants, the job of the first one is to figure out where we are. You know what I mean? Figure out like this land that we've found ourselves in. So that was my job, is to like be able to I still to this day make calls from my mom, like, hi, this is Chris Gandin. I'm calling for my mother. You know what I mean? Like I still, you code switch, right? And you're like, you have this way of like interfacing with those systems that otherwise I think people, immigrants don't have the chance to.
Right. And so when you said your job was to assimilate hard, what was that like for you?
I mean, that means like, I think now we probably use the word code switching maybe more than assimilation, because I think we understand that it's more of a spectrum, right? It's not like I assimilated, I became this one thing. I became somebody who could speak English very well, who forgot my Vietnamese, who is very comfortable interfacing in small town America. And I think now we probably would call that more code switching. We would consider that, more like, yeah, like it's not just that you are this one thing, but back then it was like, oh, well, now you're an American, you know what I mean? And I think back then, especially, there was very much a sense of like, well, there's Americans, meaning white Americans, right? And then there's not, right? And there's everybody else. And that's look, thankfully, and changed, I don't know, like in the process.
You're like something, hopefully, fingers
Yeah,
crossed.
I'm Asian, but like I think I come across, even though I speak a lot about emotions and whatnot, I come across pretty like dudeish,
Is that on your business card?
Dudeish, pretty much dudeish.
Dudeish. I really like that. That's an adjective. That's so funny, right? And that alone gives you a kind of privilege, right?
It must, right? I mean,
Right.
and I speak good English, whatever.
No, that's so interesting. When
I will say I'm a lot less angry now though than I was in college. This is what I was thinking about before we talked. In college, if you'd met me, I was a very different person. I was lived up in Indiana, and there was certainly racism there as well directed towards me. I think I'd never seen that many white people is when I moved to Indiana. I just hadn't seen that many like in one place before. And yeah, I mean, certainly there was some, microaggressions and some kind of general aggressions. I remember, but I was a lot angrier back then. This is the story I was telling. I remember like my little white pickup truck, like chasing somebody, ching-chonged me in like a Barnes and Noble parking lot. And I chased them boys around the whole town, holding it like I had like a freaking tire iron. I was like, "You fucking!" I was a lot angrier. You know what I mean? I was a lot like, and it is certainly some of that was a protective factor, and some of that's role playing, and not playing roles. You know what I mean? So I was like,
Yeah.
well, I remember very much, in my early 20s being like, well, if Asian men are supposed to be so timid and whatever, I'm just gonna be this like fucking, you know what I mean? I'm just gonna like
Get in their face.
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Just be loud and angry, right? And
Right.
and then I don't know. I've had blood pressure now, so I kind of try to like meditate more.
Bring it down.
Yeah.
What That's so interesting. And also, I'm sure becoming a father, so much mellows us and puts us more in our hearts, right?
I went to grad school I was kind of focusing on social emotional learning, really specifically online, and then also in the Asian American experience. And there's when I would cry, my dad had if I showed emotions and I was having a hard time, my dad had a really hard time with it. And he was doing the best he could, and and would sometimes he would just set me outside and be like, come back when you're not crying, you know what I mean, like when you're, and he wasn't purposely trying to be mean. It was really just this is the best I can do, is I have to put you here because it just can't. So when I had my first kid, who's 11 now, I very specifically was like, hey, how do I not even break the cycle, but how do I really advance my emotional my emotional awareness and emotional intelligence, and kind of help him, just all of it. I do suicide prevention work, mental health work, and I have done for almost 22 years now, maybe. I think that's math is right. But the first time I went to actual therapy myself was when my son was born. And I was like, well, I got some stuff I got to figure out, right? I was like, let me go ahead and process some of this stuff myself. And so that was very much hopefully, my gift to him early on, was to
I love that.
Take care of some of that.
And what did you feel like you learned from that therapy that has affected you as a father, or your ability to give him space to be an emotional person?
It's a great question. I loved my therapist. She's kind of legendary in Austin. And, I think one of the things she helped me focus on was she was very much, she very much works in mindfulness, and just kind of being more curious about things rather than judgmental, right? Especially when it comes to my own feelings and how I'm feeling about something, and just noticing. I always tell the story when I do talks, because a lot of folks are, speaking of masculinity, always curious, what is therapy like? A lot of guys maybe haven't been, right? Unless they're forced to or required to or whatever. And I tell the story that, so as a refugee, one of the things I held as going through my whole life really was that when I got hungry, I got really scared. I got not just hangry, but really oh my God, what if I die? Basically, it's kind of what I, would jump to, right? What if I die? So she's like, what would you tell your kid if they were hungry? And I was like, we live where we live, in Austin. And so there's tons of food everywhere. We could stop anywhere and get food. And she's like, cool. Yeah. What if you did that? And then also carry a snack bar with you? And I was like, holy shit. Oh my God. You know what I mean? So I tell that story because so she's like, do that for a week. See how you feel. Literally bought Luna bars or whatever, and carried them around. Fine. I'm fine. I don't even think about that anymore. Right. And so I tell that story because it's one of the, I think people think of emotions and therapy specifically as a very, I don't know, it's very wrought, very hard to jump into sometimes when you face these demons. You're like, oh, it's too big. Sometimes it's as simple as carrying a snack bar. And I think it's brilliant, right? I think that it's so true.
So brilliant.
Yeah.
And also a good advertisement for Luna bars.
Sure.
Also for therapy,
Sponsored.
Being you won't have to go into your childhood. Just, you might just be dealing with hunger issues.
Just have a snack. Yeah, totally. Right. I feel like Snickers kind of did that, right? Isn't that their whole thing? Yeah.
Totally, it is.
So funny. No, but it's true. It was oh, sure. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, I love that. And obviously you do go deeper and do deal with your demons. Were you able to unpack your feelings around your father's inability to kind of hold space for you emotionally?
Yeah, and my dad now is a very different person than he was then, right? He was new to the country. He was, had a lot of PTSD from the war. He was working, full time plus, overtime. He was working 15 hours a day, 16 hours a day. Now he's retired, and he's great. He's great. Him and his grandkids love each other a lot, and I love him. It's a very different relationship, so that's interesting, right? That's just by nature changed a lot.
Yeah.
And then certainly just as a father and seeing other fathers operate too. It's not just my dad. It's it really is that's part of the generational thing too, right? I think that there is a moment where a lot of I consider myself kind of cusp of Gen X and millennial, a lot of Gen Xers, young Gen Xers maybe realize oh, we gotta get a hold of this situation. right? And like figure out,
I got a
like,
handle on this.
we got a handle on it, because it's obviously not like, realizing like, you mentioned toxic masculinity, realizing like, and that can mean so many things, but like it's bad for everybody. It's not just like patriarchy, like the idea of, all of these things being the breadwinner, da 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 da. It's hard on everybody. And it's still hard on me. Like, I don't pretend, I mean, like, this is the thing, there's no secret about it. I think sometimes I talk to folks that that kind of like feel like they're like, oh, what's your secret? What do you do? I'm like, there's literally, it's hard all the time. Like between like being a man, being a refugee, being an immigrant, being a dad, all of this stuff kind of intertwines. And sometimes one of the places it meets is like, so yeah, I'm an artist, and I write, I make music. I do these things that I just kind of, I think my therapist referred to it as like I was like, why do I do these things? She asked me, she's like, why do you do that stuff? Is it because you want to be famous, or because you say? I was like, no. She's like, is it she's like, it sounds like it's more just a compulsion. Like, you have to do this. I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Right. And so one of the things that's weird is that I feel like in the American, in Vietnamese American culture, there's a sense that like back home, there's poets and there's artists and there was musicians, and they're allowed to be that. But here, because of, we're new here, or we were new here, right, is that we have to just be doctors and lawyers and stuff to make the money and make the cult family legacy. Like, we don't get to be artists yet. And so
that's so fascinating.
Yeah, right. You kind of look down on when you're an artist here. That's changing. I mean, there's so diasporic Vietnamese artist network exists now. There's a lot of Vietnamese writers that are out, that are doing amazing things.
How do you feel this culture sees or handles being Asian American male?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's changed so much. I remember when I was my first girlfriend, my second girlfriend in high school, said that he's pretty cute for an Asian guy. You know what I mean? And she was half Asian herself, right? And that was totally like, yeah, that tracks. Like, that feels about right. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like back then, man, hey, part of it is probably just not knowing, like being that, awkward teenager and not knowing, not having no real sense of how your attractiveness or whatever, that's
right. No, but that's also like, what?
Oh, it's pretty, yeah, it's pretty wild, right? But and that's really the way it was. It was very much like, I remember even just like early dating, like in my 20s, man, like I was at Columbia, I was doing good. Like I should, like I was living in Brooklyn, like I was cool, you know what I mean? And I remember thinking like, oh, like no one's going to want to date me, because and in fact, I remember like those like early dating sites, right? Like they would be like, oh no, they would, you can exclude who you don't want to date. And a lot of times it was like no Asian guys. It was just like straight up. There was a sense of like, well, Asian men aren't like sexual and sexually interesting creatures, basically, right? Like Asian women certainly are. They're exotic and awesome, right? You know what I mean? But Asian men weren't considered that.
No, that's changing. What I was wondering your experience, because I feel like there's such a desexualization of Asian men on TV and the media, and like how that, as you said, is starting to change with sexy Asian.
Oh, it's a thing now, right?
Like didn't exist before.
Yeah, BTS. I mean, like South Koreans. There's a lot of like, and then of course, Asia is a very big place, and so there's a lot of there's talk right now in the community of like, so I'm so as a Southeast Asian, like we're kind of like the brown Asians, right? And then so like certainly like the Crazy Rich Asians and BTS, those are all fairly pale skinned Asians, you know what I mean? So like us brown Asians are still kind of like waiting for
your moment in the sun.
Waiting for a moment.
That's so interesting. So you find that within the identity, there's still a ranking, and anything that like is more quote unquote white.
Anything adjacent to whiteness, right?
Adjacent to whiteness. Oh my God, that's so gross.
It's so gross. And I know, right? And again, and that even becomes something that's like, well, what am I going to do about that? Like, I don't know. And my kids look, my kids are half white, and I don't know if even they could pass, like looking at them, I'm like, you look Asian to me, like they look like Asian kids. But I'm happy that they're not only just the Asianness, like they're growing up, and God, the kids are so good. I'm so excited to talk to you about this, because like the kids are awesome. My son, so Felix he plays a Red Dead Redemption online, and it's it's just like a cowboy game. They just go kill each other, and like you can kill a KKK. It's pretty cool. So they just go, and so and it's Rockstar, right? So people that make GTA, like it could be, it could be, and sometimes is a fairly toxic place, as a lot of games can be. but they don't have to be. And the group that he plays with is like this lovely, like queer, trans, like non-binary group of kids all from all over the world. One of his best friends is English, and like he just has this great group of people. And they don't, I think that what I love about it is, they certainly in the Discord, they introduce each other by, they introduce the pronouns. There's like name, preferred name, pronouns. And I think maybe not where they live, it's like, it's very safe as well, and then they kind of go about like, cool, let's go kill people. You know what I mean? Like it's great, right? Like it doesn't have to be, it's very simple to them. I think they don't, they're like, great, cool, we respect that. If you change it, let me know. Boom, let's go, raid some towns,
Right. So I'm interested in that because we have a no gun policy in our household, and like no killing. I even have an issue with them killing lanternflies, and they're like an invasive species. So I'm interested because of the level of violence, and this kind of connects to the suicide prevention work you've done and all the stats you see about men being more prone to self-violence and external violence. And I'm curious your feelings about that. Obviously, like this is permissible to you, right? Sure. So anyway, if you could just talk a little bit about that kind of relationship between being male and doing anything that is considered violent,
right?
And how that might connect to your suicide prevention.
Both of my kids are very much storytellers, right? And they very much understand narrative and structure of like and of story, I think. And so by that I mean they can separate like, oh well, that's a gun in that we're using in the story, but like he has no like he has no violence about him, what I mean, like when in his real life,
That's wonderful. Okay.
Yeah, I think he very much is able to separate. I know he's able to separate those two things.
What I love about what you're saying is it seems like people in this culture, and I say people very generally because I can't cite anyone right now, but want to blame video games for the increase in violence or school shootings or the increase in suicide.
The reason that men die by suicide is because women actually attempt suicide. I want to say 2 to 1 on men, right? So women attempt more, but they use less lethal means. I'm generalizing, so and this is using older binary gender terms, right? But like,
yes.
So yeah, generally women use less lethal means, meaning not guns, and so that therefore they just die less. Guns are very effective at close range, right? And so white men who tend to own, who are a big demographic of people that own guns in the country, when you add just easy access to a deadly weapon, then and you add, untreated mental illness and social, social understandings around like what masculine men have to be, and then you throw in what's, what happens in our middle ages sometimes, which is like, stuff changes. We lose jobs. We, spouses, like things change. Our life picture changes. And so men have less capacity to hold all that stuff because we don't have the tools, built in. And then a gun is easy to access, right? And you drink a lot or whatever, so there's these like kind of, there's these cocktails, right? Or not drinking cocktails, but there's these like recipes that just equal
like the perfect storm, right?
Totally.
Yes.
Yeah. And they equal like, yeah, that's going to happen. I've been thinking a lot about, I've worked a few, after school shooting incidents, helping, communities and schools to rebuild. And that's the hardest work I've ever done. I'm actually weirdly, because I've been doing suicide prevention so long, I'm okay, like emotionally doing suicide prevention work. I find anti-violence work in that way a lot harder. Right. So like standing in a cafeteria.
Explain the difference for you?
It's going to get deep. Okay. So I was working with the Tulalip tribes where they had just this awful incident of, not going to go too much into it, but basically a beloved tribal kid killed himself and 5 of his friends in the school cafeteria. And it wasn't because he was mad at them, it's because he loved them very much and he was trying to get them out of what he perceived as a bad situation. Right. And it is one of the most tragic things I've ever, kind of helped with. The community is lovely, and the community really rallied, like the tribe really rallied around itself and around the larger community that was affected by it. And that's for me, you know, I had my kids were like 5 and 1, you know, when I was doing that work, right? And 5, 6, and that's really hard when you have kids that age, you know, who and I don't know, it's just harder for me. And then you have these school shootings where they're just kids, and you're like, oh God, really rough for me, you know. And I've done other work. I helped launch the Games and Online Harassment Hotline, which I'm really proud of. They do great work, and it's similarly it's anti harassment, which is by nature kind of side by side with with anti-violence work. And I had emotionally a harder time with it. So I stepped down as a director. I'm still on the board, and I'm still very active with them. But yeah, I just, I found it really hard to parse those two things.
Right, because you're living with kind of an undercurrent fear of not wanting your children to be shot, right? And
Yeah, sure.
so it's like this over identification with these families of what that would be like. Whereas it sounds like you're able to separate out a little bit with the suicide prevention work. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about that and like what that looks like or what it has looked like, because I personally don't know the difference between violence prevention and suicide prevention, because they're very similar.
They are very similar. And suicide is certainly a violent act, right? Like it fits under violent deaths.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you're asking kind of gets to where I am professionally, like where my mind is at and where the field is going a little bit around suicide prevention. Okay. I feel like for a long time, certainly crisis prevention and making sure that people, had access to someone to help at that crisis moment was really the like paramount in the community. And then what we started doing was listening to more people who had with lived experience of suicidality, and realizing, oh my gosh, like, of course we have to go way up the spectrum and like way upstream, kind of like to help people, with social emotional intelligence and just learning and resources and support and money. And there's this wide range of things that we need to do beyond just like being available for them for a call, of course, while also offering that, right? While also offering.
But that's not the only thing.
It's not, and the field, I think, and certainly my sense is moving much more towards like supporting the entire ecosystem of emotional health, which is harder, of course. You know what I mean? Like it's not as straightforward as like running a hotline. I think we're meant to be able to support each other. I think you've heard me talk about this, like, but after disasters, after whether it's man-made or natural disasters, as we're seeing in Florida, what's going to happen right now is that people are going to send boats, right? So like, after when the last hurricane hit Houston, people from Louisiana, sent boats where they sent food, they help each other. After 9/11, you line up for blood, even though nobody needs blood. We want to help each other. It's something I get real nerdy about. So the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, one of the things he gets super wrong about people is that he has this weird, the sense in that world that people are going to kind of do whatever the bad guy says. And the society is really tenuous and is going to fall apart at any minute. I don't believe that. I think that by nature, we want to help each other.
This interview is specifically for parents of young boys. Is there anything you've kind of gleaned from the last 20-something years of working in this field that you could share that could potentially be helpful?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll speak directly to suicide. And there's tons of resources, and we can.
I just thought I'd ask.
But so no, totally. So I'll link. I think the biggest one is being very direct. Suicidality is something that kids experience, right? Like I don't have the exact stat off the top of my head, but it's definitely common. I think one of the biggest things is that, if you talk about it with your kid, if you ask them directly, hey, are you experiencing like thoughts of suicide? Like there's a common understanding that might like cause them to then be suicidal. It's actually opposite. The opposite is true. Asking about it will basically like open up the conversation. It'll normalize it. It opens up the conversation. And so that's a big one, have the conversations with them. People get really scared of it, understandably, like when it's your kid. I mean, hey, when it's your kid and they have a cold, it's scary, right? So your kid experiencing any kind of suicidality is really scary. But there's tons of resources available to help, to help with that. And don't be afraid to take advantage of them, especially Asian folks. I think there's this huge stigma in the Asian community around mental health, and like it happens just by nature of where we live and the times that we're in. Like kids are going to need help. So we did a study 10 years ago on how people talk about suicide online, and it's not what you would expect. It's not like, oh, I'm going to kill myself today, or like these aren't it's more like I'm over this, like I'm done, like this is too hard, like it's much more like a nuanced conversation. And so those, for me, like when I think about like looking for warning signs, when you look at the long list of warning signs, it's like we all have these, these are all things that happen to us, but it's about change in behavior. It's about like, are we doing less of the things we care about? Even small, like if it's like, hey, they love playing this video game, they haven't shown up on it a little while. They love cooking and they just don't cook, whatever, like these small things.
If I could just synthesize quickly, and if you could synthesize after, but like the advice you'd give to parents is kind of twofold. One, pay attention to subtle differences in behavior or language that seems to be apathetic or giving up, right? And two, to normalize the discussion and not be afraid of asking, because the misnomer is that if you talk about it, it'll happen.
Right. Yeah, it can be a lot. It can be quite simple, right? It can be just as simple as like, hey, I've noticed haven't been doing the stuff you normally do lately. What's going on? Like, do you want to chat about it? If they push back, no, not really. I'm like, hey, I'm literally just checking, and you can call me like ridiculous, but like want to make sure, like, are you, having any thoughts of suicide? Have you any thoughts of that, like of like not wanting to be here, ending your life, and letting the kid maybe say, no, and then maybe come back to you and like realize like, oh, that's a safe thing to talk about.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's great advice.
So one of the things I've been doing over the last few years, really mentioning the games hotline and the native hotline, is like working with communities to create kind of like very specific resources, right? So, Trans Lifeline, these are all hotlines. Certainly, it's just I work in the hotline space. Trans Lifeline is wonderful, right? In that they exist for the community. They're run by the community. They actually have a non-intervention approach, right? So they realize that like trans kids are more likely to, have negative engagements with police. So they don't, they will not call emergency rescue. So there's a lot more of these like smaller, community-based resources out there now than there were 10 years ago. And I would say I think utilize those, right? So like, well, if your kid's into something, there probably is a mental health thing. Like, so like I'm really into D&D, like there's certainly like a few mental health D&D, like resources, right? And things. And so I think that there's ways to like combine the interest that they naturally have with like, hey, this is also like normalizing the support around that.
Yes.
Recognizing those as protective factors, and then building up support for those things.
I love that. And if there's a father out there that's having a hard time supporting their son emotionally, kind of like your dad having a hard time supporting you, what advice would you give him?
So much of it is healing yourself. So much of it is like getting right with how you were raised, and like, how do you want to be raised, like, or how do you want to raise your kids? And you have a choice, right? Like this is something you can stop, you can address for yourself, but you really do you have to like, you can't do it just for your kids. You have to do it for yourself.